and we are ready to begin. So this one is not. Yeah. Which is, yeah, which is okay. So I have already mentioned the topic for today. I already thanked those that I intended to thank, except for you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your interest. And I hope what you learn you will also pass on to your loved ones. So I already mentioned what's ahead. So one more time, why do vegans and vegetarians die of neurological conditions? That's on Tuesday. Wednesday, most common nutrient deficiencies among vegans and vegetarians. And then Thursday, most common dietary misconceptions among vegetarians. And then Friday, as I mentioned, either this particular topic, which is actually, I research vegans and vegetarians. That's my line of research. I publish on vegetarians and vegans, and most of my publications, not all, but most are actually on pregnant and lactating women, though I also have publications on older adults as well, vegan and vegetarian, okay? Now you might wonder, why have I decided to pick on vegans and vegetarians, okay? And it is not, definitely not to bash those vegans and vegetarians, because if I do that, I'm gonna be bashing myself. I'm one of them. I actually was drafted to the Polish army. I'm from Poland originally, even though I speak with this distinct southern accent, but I was born in Poland under communism, and when I was 21, I had an option of either go to jail, go to prison, or to be drafted to actually Polish Air Force. So I was drafted to the Polish Air Force, and I was drafted 3 weeks after my baptism in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. On April 6th, I was baptized. On April 28th, I had to go to the military base. Interestingly, it was on the Sabbath. It was April 28th, Sabbath, and I had to be there between 8 and 12 in the morning. And I went to church, and I spent time in church with church members, and then I spent the entire Sabbath with them. And after the Sabbath, I went to the military base. Well, they put me to jail for a few minutes for being late, and then this soldier came, and you already are in trouble, and he was talking. Well, I was in more trouble later on, because I realized that pretty much everything that they served was pork. So if they served soup, there was pieces of meat in the soup, which was pork and everything. And what they served for dinner was bread and pieces of pork. That was all 6 days a week, So I knew right away that I would be safe if I become a vegetarian, right? Because if I don't eat meat, I don't have to worry whether it was pork or something else. So I became a vegetarian kind of from necessity, But interestingly, in that little town, there was a very little church, like 10 or 12 members, And I would probably have starved to death if it wasn't for these members. They would literally come to the military base, and they would, ask me to come for a visit. And then on the Sabbath, I would go and spend time with them. And, you could imagine how much I ate on the Sabbath, to make up for all the lost weight and stuff. So, and another thing I want to mention is that if you go to the bookstore, you will actually find my book called In Defense of Vegetarianism. So again, I'm not against the vegan or vegetarian diet. I am one, in the 41 years or so I've been on and off. I call myself actually a practical vegan, meaning when I'm at home, most of the time I'm vegan, but sometimes it's not practical. Like if I go and visit my mom, and my mom is going to make a vegan burger, but she's going to dip it in an egg, I'm not going to make any problem with it. I'm just going to enjoy it. Another thing is when I go to participate in Pawlak, I don't have a habit of asking members what they put in the ingredients in the dish. I just put stuff on my plate, and I enjoy, that food, okay? The other reason is, this is again what I focus in my research. So I'm familiar with the literature, what others publish, I know what I publish. And it's, I think, good when you actually speak about something that you're familiar with, right? So that's a good reason also. And then another one is, I lecture on vegan and vegetarian diet everywhere. I've been on 5 different continents. I remember this one time where I did not intend to actually give any lectures, but I posted some pictures from Japan on my Facebook. Well, it turns out that I have a Japanese friend, originally from Japan, who lives in the US. And so she emailed me and said, "Are you in Japan?" And I said, "Yep, I'm in Japan, having a wonderful time." And then she replied, said, "Can you have a lecture, whatever?" And I'm like, "Are you me? I am on my vacation." In the next lecture, she said, "You are going to have a lecture on Saturday afternoon in the Adventist hospital in Tokyo. So-and-so is going to come and pick you up, And so, yeah, I've been, in many different places, and I lecture on professional conferences and stuff like that on this particular topic, okay? And then maybe even most importantly, I would like to emphasize specific aspects of vegan and vegetarian nutrition that you may or may not be aware of. Because I know when I became a vegetarian, I had a lot of misconceptions that I adopted from my Adventist vegetarian and vegan friends. And then while studying and reviewing literature and reading papers, I learned that, what I knew about or what I believe in this aspect is actually inaccurate. Okay? But I also want to mention, in case you are not a vegan or vegetarian, that what I'm going to share with you will be applicable to not just vegans and vegetarians. Okay? And I hope you will see that. Okay? Now, so back to the topic. Why do vegans and vegetarians develop and die of heart disease? Now, before I answer this question, or before I partly answer this question, because I'm going to add to my answer, to today's answer, a little bit tomorrow as well. I want to give you just like amazing facts, right? Like Pastor Battle does. Give you an amazing fact about heart disease. And here it is. Did you know? 50% of men and 64% of women who died suddenly of CHD, that's coronary heart disease, okay, had no previous symptoms of this disease. Okay? They never realized that they actually had a problem. The first symptoms they received was a heart attack, and they dropped dead. And so I believe it is important to discuss it. And the very first time when I asked this question, actually, I didn't ask it. Someone asked me this question, and I then struggled with answering this question, was back in March of 2013. I was invited to go to Sharon Seventh-day Adventist Church in Charlotte. Anyone from there? Yeah? And I had 2 lectures, I remember. And in the intermission, this couple came to me. I would say they were in their 70s. And he told me he had never eaten meat in his life. He was a lifelong vegetarian. But then he said he just had quadruple bypass surgery. And then he asked me, why would I need quadruple bypass surgery? I can't remember what I answered. But it just happened that they invited me back in September of the same year, 2013. And after one of my lectures, this fellow comes to me, this brother comes to me, and he tells me he's 60-something years old and he's been a vegetarian for 30 plus years. And then he told me 4 months ago he had stroke. And then he said, why would I have stroke? And it was like, okay, this is providential. So when I got home that Sunday afternoon, that particular week, I started researching why would a vegetarian and or vegan, and especially lifelong one, develop and die of heart disease. But interestingly, these are not isolated cases. I don't know if you realize it. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples, okay? You may not be familiar with this particular individual, and I don't even know how to pronounce his last name, but he was the founder and the president or director of the American Vegan Society for many years. He died of a heart attack at 66. Now, they say that they had some family history of heart problems. Possibly, that was possibly the reason, but could it be something else, or could it be something that contributed to him dying? What about this one? I don't know if you may or may not be familiar with him. Michael Clark Duncan, I think it's pronounced, okay? A relatively well-built and relatively young. He was actually a spokesman for PETA. Are you familiar with PETA? they promote and focus a vegan diet, right? PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. And if you may not be able to, but if you read this text on top on the left upper side of the screen, it says that going vegetarian can prevent, and it lists all kinds of diseases, including heart disease. He died of a heart attack at his young age. Now, if you are not familiar with these two, you may be familiar with Dr. John McDougall. He died when he was 77. What about our pioneer of the coronary health improvement project, right? He died, he was 77. And again, there may have been something that contributed, right, in addition to his diet. And I could go on. I actually selected a few examples. I could go. The list is much, 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 much longer. And so I want to ask yet again, vegans and vegetarians die of heart disease, or stay rather than ask, in spite of having improved heart disease risk factors, okay? According to the American Heart Association, there are 8 risk factors. We call them traditional risk factors for heart disease. They are divided into 2 categories. Key risk factors, which include hypertension, high LDL cholesterol, smoking, and then other risk factors, which include diabetes or blood glucose control, okay? Overweight and obese, poor diet. That means diet that contains very, very few fruits and vegetables, is based on refined grains rather than whole grains, things of that nature. Okay? Physical inactivity, excessive alcohol use. Interestingly, we know from research studies that those that are checked, vegetarians and vegans, have better profile of this. Okay? Vegans and vegetarians have lower risk for hypertension. They have lower blood pressure. They have lower LDL cholesterol, and so on and so on. And also we know from studies that those that I checked right now, that fewer vegetarians and vegans smoke, okay? They are more physically active, and fewer of them abuse alcohol. So in reality, if you are a vegan or vegetarian, likely you are better off when we consider these risk factors in comparison to someone who is not a vegan and vegetarian. Now, I want to give you just a brief overview. Let's look here at blood pressure, okay? So here we have a review, okay? Every time you see on my screen a meta-analysis, it means a review of published studies. So here, if you look at Fontana, that's one study. And then all these names here, these are studies. And you look at this graph in here, notice favors vegetarian diet, okay? So what these dots here mean is that vegetarians have lower systolic blood pressure, okay, in comparison to non-vegetarians. This has been shown in the bulk of available studies, okay? The same is true of diastolic blood pressure. Systolic is the higher number, diastolic is the lower number, right? We have the same pattern, okay? Vegetarians have lower blood pressure. Remember, blood pressure / hypertension is the key risk factor for heart disease, okay? When we look at blood lipids, okay? So what we know is here we have total cholesterol. Again, vegetarians and vegans have lower total cholesterol in comparison to non-vegetarians. The same goes for LDL cholesterol. And then here, this quote gives us specific figure to what extent we are better off if we are vegetarian or vegan in terms of this cholesterol level. Notice, in randomized controlled trials, compared to baseline values, primary plant-based and lacto-ovo-vegetarian dietary interventions were associated with decreases of total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol of about 10 to 15%. Vegan dietary interventions were associated with decreases of approximately 15 to 25%. And combination dietary interventions, vegetarian diet with additional fibers, soya, and nuts, were associated with decreases in approximately 20 to 35%. So again, another traditional risk factor for heart disease, if you are vegetarian or vegan, you are better off. Let's look at diabetes. This is actually from, notice, the Adventist Health Study 2. And what they found is that in comparison to non-vegetarians, all vegetarian types had lower risk for type 2 diabetes, especially vegans. 62% lower risk, again, in comparison to non-vegetarians, right? If you look at, again, all of them had lower risk. Interestingly, cases of diabetes developed in 0.54% of vegans, 1.08% of lacto-vegetarians, 1.29% of pesco-vegetarians, 0.92% of semi-vegetarians, and 2.12% of non-vegetarians. Now, if you make a simple calculation, it means that if you are non-vegetarians, you have almost 4 times as high risk of being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in comparison to being a vegan. So again, it favors being a vegan and a vegetarian. And then also when we look at obesity, okay? When you look at obesity, again, data from the Adventist Health Study, we find that vegans have the lowest body mass index, which is how we assess whether someone is in a healthy weight, or obese, or overweight, or underweight, okay? And even though these numbers are not, maybe there's not a big difference between, say, 28.8 and 23.6, but you know what the difference was between them in terms of actual weight? More than 50 pounds difference, okay? And so, based on the studies that we know, including data from the Adventist Health Study 2, vegetarian diets improve modifiable heart disease risk factor, those traditional risk factors. And vegans have the best profile of these risk factors. However, and this is a quote from one of my publications in which I attempted to answer the question why vegetarians, vegans have or are at risk of developing heart disease. The improved heart disease risk factors in vegetarians compared to non-vegetarians do not always translate into a lower risk of incidence of and mortality from circulatory diseases. Mortality means death or dying from circulatory health problems. Studies that did find a lower prevalence of and mortality from circulatory health conditions among vegetarians did not always report substantial benefits, as should have been expected based on the impact of vegetarian diets on cardiovascular disease risk factors. And I'm going to give you an example here, okay? So this is, again, data from the Adventist Health Study. And I want us to compare the risk of mortality or death, okay, from different health conditions among non-vegetarians in comparison to vegans, okay? So if we look at, notice this particular column, second to the last, cardiovascular disease. Vegans only had 9% lower risk in comparison to non-vegetarians. And when we look at the middle column, this is ischemic heart disease, only 8%. Interestingly, notice pesco-vegetarians were much better off. 20% lower risk for cardiovascular disease and 35% lower risk for ischemic heart disease. And I'm going to elaborate on pesco-vegetarians tomorrow, okay? So I will not comment much on pesco-vegetarians today, although I will mention a little bit more today, tomorrow, much more on that, okay? So, one more time, a question: what predisposes vegans and vegetarians to develop heart disease, okay? And interestingly, in part, this question was answered many, many years ago. This is a publication notice from 1969 rather, okay? Some of you were not yet born, right? At that time, okay? And notice the title here. This is a title of the publication, Vascular Pathology of Homocysteinemia for the Pathogenesis of Atherosclerosis. Now, atherosclerosis is the underlying cause of heart disease, okay? We'll elaborate on this a little bit, okay? I want to focus on this particular word, homocysteinemia. In fact, I'm going to add yet another component to this word. Here it is, hyperhomocysteinemia, okay? If you are not familiar with the medical language, you see the explanation on the slide. Every time you see emia, it means blood, okay? Or in the blood, okay? Hyper, of course, if you see a hyper child, right? It has someone who has a lot of energy, right? In this context, is elevated or more than what it needs to be, okay? And the middle part is homocysteine. How many of you have heard of homocysteine? Anyone? Okay? For those of you who haven't, it's like cholesterol, okay? We know that cholesterol is actually essential for our health. The problem is when? The problem is if it's elevated, you see? If we have higher cholesterol than it needs to be, then we may be at risk for, cardiovascular disease. We may be also at risk for Alzheimer's, okay? The same with homocysteine. Homocysteine is absolutely essential for life. Every cell in the body makes this compound called homocysteine. The problem is when it is elevated. Unlike cholesterol, which is implicated in heart disease, in Alzheimer's, elevated homocysteine is implicated in many different health conditions, including heart disease, including those I will be discussing tomorrow, and some others which we will not have time to discuss. And I want to give you an example. This is not in vegetarians or vegans. This is just in the general population. But notice a review of studies based on, or review of data based on 12 studies with a lot of participants, okay? They found that individuals in these studies, with the highest compared to those with the lowest homocysteine, had 66% higher or increased risk for coronary heart disease, death, 68% higher death from cardiovascular disease, and then as much as 93% higher risk for all cause, not just circulatory problems, but other health problems. And so we can see here, based on this review, how important it is to keep homocysteine in what we would call normal level, right? Which I will explain what that means in a moment, rather than keeping it elevated, okay? Notice a quote from this publication. My style of teaching is let those who write those publications speak, okay? So you will see that I have data and I have quotes, but I tried my best to keep it relatively simple so all of us will get something that will be relevant to us from these lectures. Each increase of 5 micromole per liter in homocysteine level increases the risk of coronary heart disease events. That means either heart attack or whatever, let's say pain in your chest, things of that nature, okay? By approximately 20%, and here's the important word in this statement, independently of traditional coronary heart disease risk factors, you see? So you may have lower blood pressure, you may have good cholesterol level, you see? You may not be overweight or obese, okay? But if you have elevated homocysteine, okay, it will still predispose you to develop whether heart disease, stroke, other health conditions of this nature, okay? Interestingly, elevated homocysteine or hyperhomocysteinemia is common among Seventh-day Adventists, okay? I say that because I am familiar with the data from the Adventist Health Study. This is a slide that I adopted by permission from Dr. Haddad from Loma Linda University, and she presented this data at one of the international congresses on vegetarian nutrition that was held at Loma Linda University in California, okay? And you can see here percentage of Seventh-day Adventists with elevated homocysteine per diet group. And we can see that here, notice 45% of vegans had elevated homocysteine, 30% of lacto-vegetarian, and so on, and this included also non-vegetarian. Well, there is an interesting nuance in this data that I need to emphasize, and that is, notice what Loma Linda researchers considered elevated homocysteine. It was considered 15 or above, right? 15 or above. Well, what we know from research studies is the following. We have shown that risk of coronary artery disease is represented by a continuum of total homocysteine concentration with substantial risk occurring between 10 and 15 micromoles per liter, okay? And so what we know from studies is that the criteria of what constituted elevated homocysteine should not have been 15, but should have been what? Should have been 10, which tells me that more than likely, not just 45% of vegans have elevated homocysteine, but it could be 50, could be 60, could be more, right? And the same goes for the other groups, okay? Notice mean homocysteine concentration above 10 among vegetarians was reported in 32 of 34 studies. So it is very common. It could be applicable again to you, okay? So another question, what causes hyperhomocysteinemia or elevated homocysteine among vegans and vegetarians? And I'm going to propose today 3 different reasons, but I don't have time to elaborate on all the reasons. Plus, I don't want anybody to fall asleep if I keep talking about all the additional reasons. It may be just too long to sit here, right? So here are the reasons. Number 1, poor intake of vitamin B12/vitamin B12 deficiency, okay? I'm going to elaborate on that in a moment. High intake of folic acid. Folic acid is just like vitamin B12. Folic acid is a B vitamin, okay? And then the third one is low intake of dietary protein. You know, sometimes when I read what some people who promote vegetarian or vegan diet, what they wrote or what they said about protein, it seems like they bend over backwards to say how little protein you can eat that would be enough. What we know today from many studies, not a handful of studies, but many studies, that if you actually increase your protein intake from plant foods, you will be better off. You will have a lower risk of many different conditions. Now, if you do the same from animal foods, meats and animal products, your risk will increase. But from plant foods, you should absolutely focus on protein-rich foods. I will elaborate on that slightly as well. But I want to focus mainly on the first one because this is the most important factor when it comes to homocysteine, okay? And again, from my paper, I quote, vegetarians with low vitamin B12 status, every time you see status means blood concentration, okay? That's just medical jargon, okay? Vitamin B12 status are predisposed to developing circulatory health problems regardless of their favorable profile of traditional heart disease risk factors, okay? And here's why, okay? This is a diagram, what happens in our cells with homocysteine. Again, every cell makes homocysteine, and it's essential. This homocysteine is essential to every cell's life, okay? But homocysteine is used to develop an amino acid called methionine, which is a very important amino acid for a variety of biological reasons, okay? But in order for homocysteine to be converted to methionine, we need vitamin B12, which is needed to activate this enzyme called methionine synthase, okay? So the conversion occurs with the action of methionine synthase, which needs vitamin B12, okay? If you have inadequate vitamin B12, this enzyme will not convert homocysteine to methionine, and you will have elevated homocysteine level, okay? Studies with adults that evaluated B12 status among vegans, vegetarians, and non-vegetarian participants showed a consistent pattern. Vegan individuals have the lowest serum B12, the highest homocysteine, and the poorest status of other B12 biomarkers such as methylmalonic acid or holotranscobalamin 2. Okay, and what this fact tells us is that if you're a vegan, you need to be mindful of what needs to happen to again increase your vitamin B12, which then will be important for decreasing homocysteine. Okay. Vegans and vegetarians are not the only groups with high risk of vitamin B12 deficiency. I wanted to mention this in case we have some who are not vegans and vegetarians and may think, oh, this is not completely not relevant to me, okay? So I just listed on the next slide just a few additional groups. Definitely not all. I have a book called Vitamin B12 Combating the Epidemic of Deficiency, in which I listed 25 different groups. Here I just listed a few. Okay, we already discussed vegans and vegetarians, but notice people 50 years and older. I have a feeling that that may be applicable to a few of you here. Those who take metformin, it's a drug that people take who have either diabetes or prediabetes. Okay, some 40 million Americans take this drug. Okay, those undergoing chemotherapy, the chemotherapy agent, they destroy vitamin B12. Individuals with this methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase gene defect, okay, which impacts this enzyme I mentioned, methionine synthase. Individuals after GI surgery, everything, we absorb vitamin B12 through the small intestines, so any surgery, whether on the stomach or the intestines, will impact vitamin B12 absorption. And if you stop absorbing, okay, you will increase your homocysteine. And, you know, patients with acid reflux, why? Because they may be taking antacids, which again will interfere with vitamin B12 absorption. And I know that you can read, so I'm not going to read all of them, but, you know, I was thinking that may be applicable to a few of you to mention at least some of these, okay? How does elevated homocysteine cause atherosclerosis, okay? Just briefly. I will not elaborate on these, okay? This is what I would elaborate on if this was like a medical conference, but this is a little bit sophisticated, so I will just emphasize two reasons. Number one, homocysteine is accumulated in atherosclerotic plaque in our arteries. And number two, homocysteine is it causes the mineralization of arteries, meaning minerals are being deposited in the arteries. We actually call it mineralization of soft tissues, okay? And the arteries are just an example of a soft tissue. The brain is soft tissue. The kidneys are soft tissues. Now, if elevated homocysteine causes mineralization of soft tissues, could it be also in the brain? Could it be also in the kidneys? Could it be also in the liver? And so on, okay? And so just let me illustrate here, okay? On the top, you see a healthy artery, okay? In the middle here, you see an artery with atherosclerotic plaque, okay? If you develop this, you will have diminished blood flow, and, you know, if you have to, you know, walk a little faster or something, you may feel a pain in your chest. And if you develop a blockage, which you see here on the bottom, that you may either develop stroke or heart attack. What we find from research studies is that this blockage or this plaque formation in the arteries contains fats, cholesterol, calcium, different product of metabolism, and homocysteine. You see? So you may be on a low-fat diet, right? But again, if you have elevated homocysteine, the plaques will also develop. Here we have the data that shows that, notice, as homocysteine increases, okay, so does the content of minerals in the arteries. And by the way, what's going to happen if we start depositing minerals in the arteries? Have you heard the term hardening of arteries, right? Instead of the arteries being elastic, they are hardened, right? And then imagine that you bought some soya sausages or whatever else soya meat from the Adventist book center, and those contain quite a bit of sodium, and sodium does what? Sodium attracts water, right? So you ingest it. The trouble is that 98 to 99% of the sodium that we ingest, we actually absorb to the bloodstream. And that sodium is going to attract all the water. And we will develop something called hypervolemia, which means more than normal water content in the blood. Okay? Now, if your arteries are elastic, it's not a big deal. But if they are hardened, what's going to happen? Your blood pressure is going to increase, right? You see? Okay? How taking vitamin B12 supplement may impact a risk of atherosclerosis, okay? And so a little background before I answer this question. So again, what we call this is the atherosclerotic plaque, okay? Which impacts, one more time, before I get to what impact. Arteries are composed of several layers. The most inner layer, it's called intima, okay? Intima. The middle layer is called media, okay? And so the plaques develop between the intima, which is here, and media, which is here, okay? And so we can measure this. We can measure the intima media thickness, which shows us how much plaques we actually have in the arteries. Everyone with me? Yeah? Okay, good. Now, of course, if we already have some plaques, this will impact what? It will cause the narrowing of the opening of the arteries where blood can flow, and it will decrease blood flow, okay? So with this background, let's look at this study. This is a study from Hong Kong, and it included 49 vegetarians, as you can see. They were long-term vegetarians. Average duration of vegetarianism was 16 years, okay? And they wanted to assess what was the intima media thickness, or the buildup of the plaque, right? And then also they wanted to measure blood flow, okay? And so here's what they found. Interestingly, this is fascinating. Notice, vegetarians, for the thickness was 0.67 millimeters, and non-vegetarians 0.56. What this means is that vegetarians had thicker plaque. They had more atherosclerosis than non-vegetarians in this particular study. Also, when we look at the blood flow, notice vegetarians are 6.4, non-vegetarians 10, which means what? Vegetarians had poorer blood flow, which is what we would expect because they had thicker atherosclerosis in the arteries, okay? And here's what the researchers concluded. When compared with age and gender-matched omnivore control subjects, vegetarians had significantly greater mean carotid, that's the artery here that goes into the brain, okay? Intima media thickness, and less branchial and other artery. FMD stands for blood flow, okay? Which is what I emphasize as well. And here's another quote from the study, interestingly. Vegetarians had significantly lower plasma vitamin B12 and higher homocysteine concentrations, which might also be associated with greater carotid intima media thickness and decreased branchial artery blood flow, that FMD, that stands for blood flow. This suggests that vitamin B12 deficiency in vegetarians might have adverse effect on their vascular health. A vitamin B12 supplementation intervention study is in improving vascular function in vegetarians is awaiting with much interest. Well, we are all these years later, we already have the results from that particular study that was mentioned in the previous quote. So here it is, the same authors, okay, study in Hong Kong with 50 vegetarians. You can see what happened here. They had 3 phases to the study, and in the study, the important part is that participants were given 500 micrograms per day of vitamin B12 supplements, okay? And in the first phase, they were given this for 12 weeks. In the second phase, they extended it by additional 24 weeks. And here we have the traditional risk factors, and then also notice the B12 and homocysteine and so on, okay? So when we look at total cholesterol level, 178, that's actually very good, right? If we look at LDL, that's below 100, that's actually very good. HDL, not bad as well. Glucose, normal. Blood pressure, absolutely fine. They were not obese. But when we look at serum vitamin B12, you will see in a moment that this is extremely poor, okay? Extremely poor, which then translated to elevated homocysteine, okay? But notice what happened. Because of the intervention being they receive what? They receive vitamin B12 supplements, right? Okay? After the intervention, serum vitamin B12 increased dramatically, okay? As a result, homocysteine HCY, that's homocysteine, dropped significantly as well. Most important, notice what happened to the blood flow, okay? Blood flow what? Increased very nicely. What happened to intima media thickness? It was what? It was reduced. Are you with me, everyone? Okay? This intervention, this giving of vitamin B12 supplement helped, or we could attempt to say, caused an improvement in vascular health, an improvement in reducing the atherosclerosis in the arteries and improving blood flow, okay? Vitamin B12 supplementation in asymptomatic vegetarians with compromised vitamin B12 status may lead to a significant improvement in arterial endothelial function. Endothelial function has to do with the inner layer, the intima I mentioned, okay? And carotid intima media thickness and potential benefit on cardiovascular health, okay? So now, considering that vitamin B12, I hope I convince you, is important in preventing heart disease, the question is, what should vitamin B12 concentration be, okay? So I'm going to give you two views on that. So here is one view based on, again, review of available studies, okay? Notice, you remember that we concluded that normal homocysteine that causes problems is what? One that is above 10, remember? Okay? So here we have on this axis, we have 10 for homocysteine, and we notice that in these studies, a level of serum vitamin B12 of close to 340, we could perhaps say 330, was associated with homocysteine 10, okay? Now, another view is by a team of researchers from England and Norway. This particular scientist here, Dr. Refsum, that's kind of my guru when it comes to vitamin B12. If I don't know something, that's who I email for answer, and she is a world-renowned researcher on vitamin B12. And according to her team, okay, plasma or serum vitamin B12 of 400 and above should be considered normal, okay? So keep in mind, in one data set we have 330, right? The other team suggests 400. Here is vitamin B12 in the 7-day Adventist group, okay? This is notice from the Adventist Health Study 2. The mean or average B12 plasma concentration was 265, okay? Considerably below where it needs to be, right? Or what it needs to be. And plus minus, notice plus minus 151 or so, which means many had what? Considerably lower, right? Some had considerably better, which is what we would like to see, but many had considerably lower. So with all the data, with all this information, I want to boil this down to this. Practical implications of what we know from research studies, including, again, research with Adventists, okay? And here it is. This is, again, from one of my publications. The main finding of this review is that vegetarians develop B12 deficiency, depletion rather, or deficiency, regardless of demographic characteristics, place of residency, age, or type of vegetarian diets, okay? Type of vegetarian diet you're on. So here it is. All vegans and vegetarians should use vitamin B12 supplements, okay? You may have heard that, oh, if you have a little cheese from time to time and maybe, a scrambled egg, a couple of times a week or something to that effect, and or if you use soya milk, which is fortified with vitamin B12, meaning you are, say, lacto vegetarian, you will be fine. Well, you may be fine. You may not die today. You may not have the traditional, you may not have the traditional symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency, such as tremors, for example, or such as elevated or larger than normal red blood cells. But what about the atherosclerosis, the underlying cause of heart disease, which doesn't develop over a few days or few weeks or even a few years, it develops over many years. And if you are a long life of a vegetarian and you keep your vitamin B12 at 265, for example, right? What about that? And tomorrow we will be talking about neurological conditions. And even though I will be focusing mainly on a different nutrient, I will also come back to vitamin B12 because I'm going to show you also that the vitamin B12 that we know Adventists have is predisposing us to stuff like brain atrophy, like hippocampus atrophy. Hippocampus is the part of the brain that is responsible for memory, and so on. So it needs to be, again, it may be, you may have B12 around 200, maybe a bit more, with not using supplements. But I believe strongly that regardless of what diet you're on, in terms of whether it's a pesco-vegetarian, semi-vegetarian, lacto-vegetarian, you need vitamin B12 supplement, okay? Let me switch to the second one for a moment, okay? And that is high intake of folic acid. Now, folic acid, again, is another B vitamin, and it's known by more than one name. Folic acid is one, another one is folate, okay? Folate, folic acid. When I say folate, folate refers to this vitamin found naturally in food, okay? So if you have, a burger or whatever, or if you have a bun or fruit or vegetables, you find naturally folate in it, okay? Folic acid is what we find in supplements, and it's the form of this vitamin that is added to flour, for example, to white flour, okay? Let's briefly look at this. This will not be as long, okay? This is kind of a conclusion already. High folate concentration impairs vitamin B12 metabolism, resulting in elevated homocysteine and increased risk of heart disease. Let me show you some interesting data. This data is from the study we known as ENHANCE study, which is actually sponsored by the US government. By law, it has to be conducted every few years, and it has to represent the entire US population, okay? And so in this particular study, what they found was that we have here, notice, in this axis, we have two groups. Those with vitamin B12 below 148, and those with vitamin B12 above 148, okay? And then we have different concentration for folate in these individuals, 16, 23, 30, 44. What we find is that in those with higher B12, okay, the higher folate was actually helpful because it helped in decreasing the homocysteine concentration. But that was not so for those with lower vitamin B12. For those, higher folate concentration actually did what? Increased homocysteine level, okay? So if you may wonder what it is, well, first, Adventists ingest higher than recommended amounts of folate, okay? So here's the data, and again, it's divided by diet group. The recommended daily intake of folate is 400 micrograms, okay? Notice here the median for, say, lacto-vegetarians, more than 700. For vegans, more than 700. For pesco-vegetarian, more than 700. For semi-vegetarian, more than 700. For non-vegetarian, almost 700. Okay, so we already, okay, ingest a lot of folate. Okay, practically, what am I getting at? Okay, number one, do not use folic acid supplements. Okay, I will elaborate briefly on that one. And secondly, discard fortified with B vitamins nutritional yeast. And if you like nutritional yeast, you want to use them, buy the non-fortified variety. Why? I'm going to show you why. Okay, first, let's begin with supplements. Okay, so because we know from studies that homocysteine can be lowered not only by vitamin B12, but also by folic acid and vitamin B6. Some supplement manufacturers actually made supplements that contain folic acid, B6, and B12. Okay, and you can see here a few examples of these. Okay, and if you add to that a multivitamin, notice this multivitamin contains 665 micrograms of dietary folate equivalent. Okay, so that's number one. Do not use those. Okay, look at your multivitamin. If it contains 400 or more folic acid, you need to change. You need to switch to another one. But another one is nutritional yeast. So this is just one example. And if you look at the content for or the dose of folate, it's 1,800 plus micrograms of dietary folate equivalent. It's huge. Again, the recommendation for folate is how much? Do you remember? 400. Okay, so this is more than 4 times what is recommended. Okay, so again, nutritional yeast may be perfectly fine, and we can find non-fortified nutritional yeast on the market. Let's briefly talk about the low intake of dietary protein as another contributing factor to elevated homocysteine. Okay, so here is another study. Notice on this axis we have total homocysteine. Here we had 2 groups. This particular compound, if I try to pronounce it, I'm going to break my tongue, so I'm not going to do that. But this particular compound actually is a biomarker of protein status. Okay, protein. And we interestingly notice that as protein status decreases, homocysteine does what? Increases. Interestingly, we don't see this in non-vegetarians. We see this in vegetarians. Okay? And this is why, before I get to this thought, specifically when we look at the amino acids, proteins are composed of amino acids, right? The key amino acids are cysteine and methionine, which are the key amino acids for vegetarians, actually. Okay, and just a few examples to show you that we have few or smaller amount of these key amino acids in plant foods compared to meats and animal products. So here's methionine. Okay, notice in beef is 1,500 plus. Here in tofu is only 500, okay? Another example, in lean pork, I know we don't eat pork, but I just wanted to give you an example, okay? More than 1,400. In quinoa is less than 200. The same goes for cysteine. So if you look at beef, almost 600, compared to in lentils, a little more than 200. Another example, in chicken, close to 600, oatmeal, more than 200, okay? And this is a study from the UK that shows that vegetarians and vegans have lower concentration of methionine and cysteine. So we actually may need to increase intake of these. The difference between non-vegetarians and vegans here was 90% lower for vegans. Practical implications, what can we do with this? Okay, here it is. Ingest a variety of protein-rich plant products. Okay, interestingly, when we think plant products, people think beans. That's actually correct. But most protein in vegans and vegetarians is ingested from grains. Okay, now grains for some reasons have bad reputations. Some people go completely grain-free, or they go wheat-free and things of that nature, okay? Now, if you have wheat allergy or celiac disease, okay, you may not need to, you cannot ingest wheat and some other grains, but you need to make sure that you replace those with another grains that do not contain gluten, that protein that causes problem with the intestines, okay? It is very important. That's number one. Number two, avoid low-protein diets. Again, if you increase protein intake from plant foods, you will actually reduce risk for different health conditions rather than increasing them, okay? And then lastly, avoid raw food diets. Why? Because if you cook the food, you will be able to absorb more of the amino acids, more of the protein, okay, than from raw foods. Now, I do believe that in the Garden of Eden, they did eat raw food, okay? Don't think that I don't believe that. No, I do. I just happen to believe that we are no longer in the Garden of Eden, okay? So, okay, just the overall conclusions from what I shared with you today. High prevalence of elevated homocysteine among vegans and vegetarians increases the risk of developing and dying of heart disease. And then the use of vitamin B12 supplements, avoidance of high intake of folic acid, and adequate protein intake can reduce risk of heart disease. As I mentioned, I'm going to add to what I shared with you today a little bit tomorrow. We'll be dealing with neurological health problems, but we are not quite yet done with heart disease. Pastor Richardson, I don't know if we have time for questions. If we don't, we do? Okay. Yes, so I prepared some handouts. Are we going to pass them on, or are we going to leave them somewhere? Okay, so we will have handouts from all the lectures, not just from this one, but from all throughout, somewhere on the table. If you are interested, you are more than welcome. Okay, we have I don't know what time it is, but looks like we have... It's about 14 minutes, say 5 minutes. Okay, 5 minutes, so we will go over 5 minutes. Okay, I see a question here.
What is the correct amount of B12 that we should get per day?
Okay, good question. So the question is how much B12 we should get per day, okay? So intake of B12, or what should be considered adequate intake of B12, depends mainly on your age, okay? If you are a teenager or young adults, you likely don't have any issues with absorption, okay? Much lower amount will be needed, okay? However, if you read, for example, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is a document that is issued by the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Agriculture in the US government, okay? They say that anyone 50 years and older should be using vitamin B12 supplements. Why? Because as we age, we lose the ability to absorb vitamin B12, okay? Absorption of vitamin B12 requires a quite sophisticated process, and therefore we need to consider ingesting much higher intake. It's a little fluid. I cannot tell you exactly how much because, again, everyone is different. I remember I got this email from a friend of mine who said this individual who was 90 years old ingest 250 micrograms. And I was thinking right away, not enough, you know. But then she added, her serum B12 is 2,000. That's way more than it needs to be, you know. So it depends. But I am 62 years old. I just had 62nd birthday on May 13. I still accept gifts, by the way, for my birthday. And I used to take 500 micrograms every other day, and then I checked my B12, and it was a little bit more than 300, like 360 something, and I would like it to be more than 400. So since I've been using 500 micrograms every day, okay? 500 micrograms is what you find over the counter in Walmart and other places like that. 200 pills in a bottle is a little bit more than $4 or $5 in Walmart, you know? That would be good for many. Now, if you are, say, older than 75, say, you may need even more than that, okay? What I typically tell people is that if you have been a vegetarian or vegan for, a year or so or longer, you may want to start with a little bit more, like maybe even take twice a day that dose for maybe a couple of weeks at least, or 3-4 weeks, and then switch to 500, okay? But again, it's a little fluid. Then again, if we are taking a medication that may interfere, it may also be. But the important thing is to start with something, and then next time you go for your physical, okay, you can educate your physician that since you are a vegetarian or a vegan, he or she needs to order vitamin B12 test. And then according to what you see, you may want to adjust the dose, you know. I see your hands. I think, sir, you were next. I'm coming closer because at my age you don't hear very good, you know. So
what do you say to somebody who, after hearing your talk tonight, this evening, concludes that maybe a non-vegetarian or a non-vegan diet is better for you in the long run?
Okay, well, thank you. So what would I say to someone who may conclude that not being a vegetarian or vegan is actually better? Well, remember the data I showed you from the Adventist Health Study too? You know, even though it wasn't much, but vegans had a 9% lower risk or 8% lower risk, depending on which conditions we looked at, right? Lacto-vegetarians also had the lower, pesco-vegetarians lower. And we see this across, regardless of whether we are talking cancer, diabetes, you know, other health conditions, vegans, vegetarians do have lower risk. I don't want you to misunderstand me. I'm not saying we should not be vegetarians or vegans because we may be at risk of this condition or that condition, okay? It is something that is part of our Adventist health message. It's actually environmentally friendly. It doesn't require, you know, the treatment of animals that we know is taking place. And it is better. I'm just saying that, you know, the impression I get sometimes from seminars like this, that the speakers comes and pretty much the message boils down to you need to become a vegetarian or you need to become a vegan. But there's more to it. Vegans and vegetarians also develop the same health conditions like heart disease and Parkinson's and dementia. And we know today why that is. And B12 is one big contributing factor. That's all I'm saying. Okay? I am not sure who was next, but I think...
Do you recommend one type of supplement over another?
Do I recommend one supplement more so than others? I usually go by the price, as long as the dose is what I'm looking for. No, I'm serious. I mean, why would we pay more, you know? So let me elaborate slightly, okay? So we can actually buy different forms of vitamin B12 supplements. One is called cyanocobalamin, okay? Another one is called methylcobalamin. And then we have adenosylcobalamin and some others, okay? And if you read enough websites, you will read that some people say you should absolutely never use cyanocobalamin. And then others say you should absolutely always use methylcobalamin. And the reality is both of them are wrong, okay? Cyanocobalamin is the best form that you can find. You know, if you look at the bottle, it would say vitamin B12, and then you go on the other side, look at the other side, and it will say how much is actually in it and what form it is, okay? So look for cyanocobalamin, okay? But if it costs in one place $7 and in the other $5, as long as both have the same dose, you go with the lower cost, and then what's left over you designate for the birthday gift I mentioned. That's kidding you. 2 more questions, sir.
Are you going to discuss the importance of minerals in the absorption and holding back homocysteine?
I was not planning much on that one, but you know, if you ask me specifically about something, I may mention, and we may have time, likely on Friday, a little bit more time to you know, discuss some other issues. Yes, ma'am. That's the second one. Yes.
I used to years ago. I'm a nurse. We gave vitamin B12 injections.
Sorry.
I gave it to my grandmother.
Yes.
So is it absorbed?
Good question.
We used to be told it wasn't absorbed by mouth like it would be by an injection.
Good question. So the question is, if an injection, B12 injections, would be better, worse, than a supplement, okay? So they are both effective in increasing your vitamin B12 concentration. The difference is that an injection preventively usually is given once a month, okay? And when you actually get it, okay, for the next couple of days, you feel like you can absolutely climb the Mount Everest. But then a few days before you are scheduled to get another one, you feel like you absolutely don't want to do anything, You have these swings a little bit, okay? Vitamin B12 supplements are equally effective, okay? But they need to be taken either every other day, every day, depending on who we are talking about, Yeah. And, you can just go to a grocery store, buy, you don't have to visit anybody, So I'm sorry, I was told 2 questions. So I am here. If you would like to ask me, I will be here waiting, and I'll be glad to